This is your fortnightly instalment where I interview a trailblazing physiotherapist that has shaped the profession we are today. In celebrating their journey, knowledge and insights, you gain the opportunity to plan and guide your own professional journey. My name is Doug Carey and welcome to Physio+10. Welcome new and previous listeners of Physio+10. Thanks for joining us again. Our special guest for today's podcast is Anna-Louise Bouvier. Welcome, Anna-Louise.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Can we start with a bit of background, like where you grew up and what your early schooling was about?
I grew up in a very small country town called Griffith, which is kind of, if you draw a line between Sydney and Adelaide in the middle, that's Griffith. And when I was growing up in the 60s, it had about 10 or 12,000 people. My grandparents came to Australia from Italy in 1952. And when I was born, we were actually living next door to my grandparents, and they didn't speak English, and I didn't speak English until I was 5. I only spoke Italian.
Wow.
So when I went to school, I had one word, which was ice cream, very important for a 5-year-old. And that was it. And so then I quickly got to school and realised that I didn't want to look like an Italian or be Italian. And my father was Australian, but he spoke to me in English. I spoke back in Italian, and very quickly I learned English, and that was that.
Okay, I wasn't expecting that at all. So that makes me ask a couple of other questions. How did your mum and dad meet?
So they met in Australia. Dad was from another small country town called West Wyalong, very much an Australian, came to Griffith, which was the big smoke in those days, to do his articles in law. And Mum was working as a translator for one of the local doctors. And so they kind of met through there, and that was it. So, we kind of grew up in a very migrant house, I guess, with a lot of extended family. And must say, whenever I kind of look at multiculturalism in Australia, and you just think, this is exactly, that next generation, they just say, work hard, go to university. My grandfather was a farrier. They were shoeing horses in 43-degree heat out in the country, and with his big leather apron and his big, in Italian it's fuoco, his big fire, and the anvil, these enormous hands, because he made his own tools. So he had these incredible, I always remember, like, one of his fingers was the same as 2 of mine. It was just incredible. And he was so strong right until the day he died. Unfortunately, developed Alzheimer's and he couldn't remember anything, but he looked strong, which was great.
Okay.
And so then I went to school in Griffith, local co-ed school, and then came to Sydney for the last couple of years, and then went to uni.
Yeah, one of my dearest friends is Italian, and she always talks about the big family get together to cook the passata or
absolutely.
do the big homemade pastas.
Yeah, it's really critical, and I think that sense of community, family, all that sort of stuff, like, it really pervades, your life forever, really, which is a very good thing.
Yeah. Hey, and where do you fall in the family? Are you a single or a triple?
No, I'm the eldest of 3, typical eldest child. I was school captain in year 6, school captain in year 10, and vice school captain in year 12. So, I was the typical good girl who always did the right thing. So, yeah, I was not very good at partying or, sort of wild. And luckily, when we went to university at Cumberland College, it was the most boring campus in the world in the 80s. It was between supposedly in the geographical centre of Sydney. Whitlam government had built this place, and it was between Rookwood Cemetery and Lidcombe Hospital. So you've got the dead and the dying, and in the middle of it you've got this campus with no bar, no on campus accommodation. You only had, I think you had physio, medical records, OT, speech pathology. There was no art students, no. So in terms of a university experience, it was very, very straight down the line.
So that leads to the question, like, when was the first time you stepped off the rails?
I don't think I ever really did, really. Sadly, I'm very much a, head down, bum up sort of girl. And I guess, I've just always been, I guess probably quite a turning point for me was, so when I went to, so I finished, uni, and I went to work with Francine St. George, who is still a very kind of well-known physiotherapist here. Have you interviewed Francine? I think you might.
No, she's on my list. Watch out, Francine, I'm coming.
Yeah. So my first year was there working at Sydney Uni in the sports clinic, and that was great. And then after that, I went to work with a woman called Josephine Key, who we both know, who was an amazing musculoskeletal physio and really incredibly passionate about, it was the days where manips was a really big thing, and it was kind of all that clinical reasoning stuff, Marjorie McGarry, all that sort of stuff was really just coming to the fore. And so Joey just used to make me sit down at the end of the bed and watch her treating patients, and every new assessment I had to do, I had to run past her and go through my logical, clinical thinking and reasoning about, why would I do that? Why would I choose this technique? What would I do? And it really was the most incredible experience to have someone really mentor you and take you on. I love this. So, it was the 80s. And one of the things I did do to step on the rail is I smoked, and so did Joey. And in my first, in our first interview, when I went for the job, we sat down and had a cigarette together. So that was about as wild as it got. We gave up years later, but yeah. So
just backtracking, how was it you got into physio? Where mum and your dad was obviously in law and your mum was an interpreter.
Yeah,
how'd you get into health?
I wanted to do law, and my father just said, it's a terrible job for a woman. Don't do law. Don't do that. And I was like, oh, you're so sexist, Dad, But then I was actually very keen on doing journalism. And it's quite interesting that two things that I would have really loved to do is teaching or media. And in fact, a lot of my career has now turned into teaching and media. And so I wanted to go to the local area news in year 10 to do work experience. And there was only one position. It was already taken. And so I ended up in the local base hospital. And I did my, sort of clinical there, and I absolutely loved it. Like I was in there going, because in those days there wasn't really a private practice in town. So everybody was there. The local football team was there. Then there were people with strokes, and I just thought, oh, this is fantastic. And really from that point on, I just said, that's what I want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's quite fortuitous in that way, wasn't? Were you a sporty sort of kid?
No. And I think I've had quite severe asthma. Spent a lot of time in hospital, actually, in the days where they thought asthma was contagious. So in my early years, I had these like memories of being 4 and 5 years old in the base hospital in these oxygen tents and in isolation, because that's how they treated asthma. It was kind of crazy, really. And I think probably, so I'd had very positive experiences from being involved with medical people, but I certainly was never sporty. And I think probably I would have loved to have been sporty. The popular girls always seem to get much more attention from boys, and I certainly didn't. And I always thought, wow, being a sporty girl would be, really great. And so I think that was probably an excellent motivation to do physio.
I thought we were trying to keep you on the straight and narrow, but it sounds like you're looking to get off the train track as soon as you could. Right.
Constantly trying to jump off.
Now, you said Cumberland was pretty boring for you. Were there any particular highlights, maybe clinically or lecturer-wise, if it wasn't social?
No, look, we had some really good friends. I think the thing was a lot of my other friends who were at university were doing 14 hours of face-to-face, and then the rest of the time they were having an enormously great time. We were doing 32 hours of contact, and it was hard yakka, but we made some great friends. In fact, I had lunch the other day with 3 friends who we met at uni on those very first days, and we're all still working, coming up to 60 this year. And we love it. In fact, one of my best friends who I met on the very first day of uni has worked for me, on and off for nearly 25 years. So it's amazing how, we made some great friends, really, really good people. We just met good people, and even a lot of the lecturers, you just look back and go, God, what amazing people they were, that they were so committed. We thought they were so old at the time. Like Jenny McConnell was one of my first lecturers, and she must have been about 23, but we thought she was so kind of grown up then. I mean, it's just incredible, really. So Catherine Refshaugi, who's, now, been head of the school at Sydney University for years, she was probably only 5 years older than me, but again, felt so much older. So, there were some pretty amazing people. We had Roberta Carr and Janet Shepherd were our lecturers. And, when I look back and think about the work they were doing in neuro, and how much their understanding of function has actually really informed so much of my musculoskeletal career, and just that they just continued to be so incredibly passionate about their career, still. I think they're still alive. I'm pretty sure Roberta is. Just pretty amazing people.
Yeah. I think it's amazing how we can look back on ages, and when we're 18 and 19 and 20, 23, 24, sounds pretty old, but when you're 45 and 50, a decade either side is not a big issue, really.
It doesn't make a difference at all, exactly.
So when you graduated from Cumberland, what really informed you or made you decide those early career decisions, like you ended up working with Joey?
Yeah.
Was that a deliberate decision, or does something just fortuitously happen?
Yeah, I think certainly my decision to go and work with Francine was, because I wanted to be one of the sporty girls, and, it was all sporty and great, and it was on campus, and it was, fantastic. But I soon realised that really sports physio is a bit like being a panel beater. You put them back together again, and then the next week they go out and have another crash. It's sort of, to me at that stage, I thought it probably wasn't, standing in the pouring rain and on a freezing Saturday. It was like, oh God, is this really what I wanted to do? And when I went to, Joey approached me through sort of other friends, and when I went to work for her, I loved I really loved the clinical reasoning side of, but why? Why is this person coming back to me time and time again? And what are the layers that have led to this person coming back? And what can I do to really prevent this person coming again? And I guess after 11 years of working there, and being a partner from the age of 26 until I was 31 when I had my first child, when I was 28 when I had my first child, I think that it really impressed upon me how much I would be saying to people, if you did your exercises, if you took my advice, you wouldn't have to keep coming back to see me, And it was just not the right environment to encourage people to develop behavioural change, true behavioural change. And I think that was probably that experience of 11 years of just having people coming back and back. And they loved me, I loved them. But I think there was a real building frustration in me that all I was doing was really plugging, leaks in dikes. I wasn't really, fixing things.
Interesting transition, isn't it? You've literally gone from being the sports physio in the rain the real true acute panel beater to move into the car restoration.
That's
Now you've almost moved into the car manufacturing analogy, where you're starting from the ground up and you're saying, look, we want to rebuild this model so it's going to last its true capacity years. And
absolutely, that's exactly it. And I think, you know, when I had the kids, and I think this is something that we're seeing as a trend, because I do some lecturing at Macquarie Uni. We do a business course, and as part of the doctoral degree, and that was actually, that's been fantastic, because that was sort of largely with me pushing, saying, you know, these kids are coming out and they need to be able to run businesses, and they need to be able to think about how to be entrepreneurs, how to think of new ways to innovate. And so we really put the course together based on that experience. But some of it really came looking now, you know, where we accepted that starting at 7 a.m, finishing at 7 p.m, having these incredibly long days, working the long hours, sometimes with big gaps in the middle of the day. This next generation of students is not doing that, of graduates is coming out. You know, you're seeing that they don't want to work those hours, certainly not for that pay. I don't know in Western Australia, but certainly in Sydney and Melbourne, in the capital cities here, you know, the housing prices, the cost of housing has really, I feel, driven a fundamental shift in the way graduates view their careers. Because, you know, where we could get by on the money that we earned and still, you know, go forward reasonably well, even as a single woman or a single person, now these kids are coming out these people are coming out having got 99, 98 in the HSC, or in their things. They've got friends who are coming out who've got, you know, perhaps lesser grades than them, and they come out into these huge jobs with big hours, and the remuneration just isn't there. So, you know, very quickly they're pivoting, sometimes completely out of the profession within 3 years. And I find that very sad, that there's not a recognition that the skill set that you have could actually take you in incredible directions. You just need to think quite laterally about, you know, what skills you have.
Okay, so that opens up a really broad question there. Like, if we are graduating these highly intelligent people, can they stay within the profession and still earn enough money to be able to afford housing and just the basics, you know, in a capital city?
Well, exactly. Maybe in their first few years out, when they're living with their parents at home, you know, that's basically you know, it's quite interesting. You know, I grew up in a multi-generational house, and that was very normal. It's really interesting that in Sydney we're seeing, you know, at the moment I've got 2 adult children who've moved back in because they're saving money to try and, you know, get back out again. And I think, you know, this is what so many of my friends, you know, we've got kids, professional kids, all living with us again, you know, as they face these things. I think you can certainly stay within the profession. The really difficult thing, I think, is because the general public and people generally can't afford to pay, you know, it's basically, you know, maths. You know, if you can't charge the general public $350 an hour for your time, for 2 half-hour consults, then, you know, you flip that round to who are you going to, you know, how are you going to pay these people? You know, if you go 30, say if it's $300 an hour that you can charge out. So if the old 30 of professional is 30% to wages, 30% to outgoings, and 30% to profit as the owner, then, you know, you've got to come up with $100 an hour for them, if you can charge out at $300 an hour. The reality is it might be $200 an hour. It might not even be $150 an hour. So then you're going backwards. And I think this is what's so hard as the practice owner, but also as the physio. And this is where you're seeing all these models. You know, when I started Physiocise, I knew I had to make more money per hour than what I could charge one-on-one. So I kind of thought, okay, so if I ran classes, how much could I make? Not that making money was the absolute driving force, but it was certainly a big part of what I was thinking in my model. And I knew that if I could make this model work, I could pay my staff nearly double what they could earn doing hands-on. So, you know, by coming up with a model where I could make more, they could make more, where they could make more, then, you know, the whole thing could really change. So it's really interesting. I mean, I'm sounding very mercenary, but I think it is an absolute fact of life now that we have to think about, you know, charging as professionals, and you know, what are the barriers to being able to charge as professionals?
Yeah. So you mentioned Physiocise. You're sort of well known within and outside the physio profession for this rehab class sort of concept for those experiencing persistent pain, which started back in the mid 1990s, I guess. So well before the common or the ubiquitous, you know, Physio plus Pilates sign that you see around the traps nowadays. Quite an icebreaker concept. You transitioned from that one-on-one to a group exercise program. It sounds like was a conscious thought, one to
totally
earn money, but also to help people.
Oh, absolutely. Like the big driver was, you know, nobody was doing their exercises. There were no personal trainers. Pilates didn't exist. It just was such a foreign concept. And so I thought, surely if I could go around to all my colleagues and say, I don't want to treat, you send me your patients once a week, I'll do education and exercise. They will be, it's a bit like the Catholic Church, you come once a week, it exonerates you of all other good deeds. And so let's see if we can actually get people to change their behaviours. And by giving them constant feedback about where they are in space, what they were doing. And so I started in the local golf club. It was $25 an hour to hire the room. And I bought a whole stack of pillows and put matching pillowcases and bought a dozen mats that all kind of matched. So it had a bit of a I tried to make it a slightly professional feel. And I got someone to make me a really good logo because it was, you know, really almost before the internet. You know, there was kind of a bit of stuff online. And I made up some really good referral pads, and I just basically reached out to all my colleagues and said, send me your patients. I'll send them back to you for hands-on. You send them to me for classes. And on the very first class, the very first day that I started with a Tuesday at 9:15 and a Tuesday night at 7. And the kids were little, and I thought, well, that way I can get a babysitter, you know, for the two ends, and it's not going to cost me too much. And I got that very first class was coming up, and I had only one real patient booked in, and I thought, my God, that doesn't look like a class, you know. And so I rang my sisters-in-law and a couple of friends and said, could you come along and could you pay? Because at that stage the classes were $12 each cash. And I said, could you pay as if you're in a class, you know, and don't let on that you know me. And that was, I often say to people, if you want to start a business, you've got to make it look like it's a success. And so these people all came along and they're all going, oh, this is good, isn't it? Well, of course, it was complete fake. And anyway, that patient ended up staying for nearly 3 years. And I told her after about a year in, I just said, you know, that very first few classes, I said, not one person in that class except for you, because I gave all my after she left, I gave them all their money back. So it was very funny.
There's a story. Now you've grown from that sort of one very successful class to, you know, 25 staff now.
Yeah.
Would you say that's organic growth, or was that something that happened in a different way?
nothing is ever organic, I don't think. You know, it takes so much work to start something new. There were so many hurdles. Trying to convince people that exercise was medicine was just, I can't tell you how hard that was. Like, now you go, oh, of course, you know, as you say, everybody's got physio plus Pilates. You know, I had a real problem even with the fact that physios took on Pilates, because to me, that dumbed down our skills, you know, because you've got, anybody can do a 3-month Pilates course, but to do what we do is just such a different thing. So I always kind of fought this notion that, you know, what we were doing wasn't just an exercise class. You know, it was a different way to rewire the brain, and it was a different way to rewire bodies. And that biopsychosocial, you know, integration of a class situation was really critical. So a lot of what I did was to put in very rigid systems around, when I first started, actually, I didn't do an initial assessment. And so people would just come in, and after the class, I would call them and say, you know, how were you after the class? And I realized that actually a lot of people were, you know, either not better or hadn't changed or were much better, but I had no way of kind of really understanding what the reasons for that were. So I set up a very detailed initial assessment. And so that was probably one of the real turning points, was to make sure that I had a really good initial assessment and to put it in a format that allowed it to be replicated. So each time we got a new staff member on, we all did the same assessment. And very soon you start to see the butterfly in the dot picture, you know, because you're all doing the same things. You're starting to get very clear patterns starting to come out. I think a big turning point for us was a fantastic sports physician called Dr. Seamus Dalton, who was an earlier adopter of Pilates. I'd sort of come across him, and, you know, GPs were hopeless with sending patients, and probably still are. I think probably with a lot of physios, it's really your colleagues, massage therapists, podiatrists, you know, those sorts of people. It's all about relationships, you know, trust and relationships. Get to know people. Do they trust you? Do they like you? Are you doing the right thing by their patients, and then sending them back? Anyway, someone said to me, you should go and see Dr. Dalton. And, you know, it's like, oh my God, he's a specialist. And what would, you know, he hasn't got time to see me. Anyway, I thought, oh, just summon up the courage. And I rang his secretary and I said, look, could I make an appointment to see him? You know, I've started this physio thing. And she said, oh, just come in, you know, come in when he's having lunch, you know, you can just come in. And I went, you know, so I walked in, and he said, come on, let's go and have a sandwich. And I was like, oh God, but you're a doctor and I'm a physio. Anyway, we went and had lunch, and he said, yep, I think Pilates is great. I think there's really something there. And he said, I won't send you any patients until you've treated me. I've got a terrible back. I've got an L4-5 spondylo. Let me see what you can do for me. And he came as a patient, and he stayed on and off for years. And 25 years later, we've, you know, had this fantastic relationship. We've taught courses together. You know, it was a real meeting of the minds in terms of, you know, we both just saw a different way of looking at treatment. And he was coming very much from a sports and rehab point of view, and that was an incredible turning point, because to have someone with his credibility say this is a really good thing. Then he told his colleagues, we met their kind of network. So it's all that organic growth, in the sense that it doesn't just happen. You know, those relationships build the next relationship, and that was a very, very powerful turning point. The other probably big one was that I could not get the health funds to recognise my scope of practice in those early days. They wouldn't say that what we were doing was physiotherapy, and I did a lot of pushing with the APA, and because of that initial assessment, we were able to start doing some quite good basic research about our outcomes. And that combination of the research and the APA and then Pilates exploding allowed us to get the rebate for classes. Now, interestingly, 2 years ago, we've lost that. And it makes me incredibly sad that as a profession, we didn't fight harder, because now what I do is now probably more becoming the scope of practice for exercise phys and exercise science, and physio is getting pushed into this kind of pain paradigm rather than a preventative paradigm.
Ooh, that's a big topic. Let's move on. You've been involved in writing several publications on health and well-being. Do you have any advice for young physios that may be considering wanting to get something published?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the reasons I got those initial things is that when I first started, within sort of a year, I realized that, the stick figures, on pieces of paper that people lost in the car on the way home wasn't cutting it. And so I've always, probably my teaching media kind of bent. I thought, well, what about if I write a little booklet? And I made this little booklet myself. And then that little booklet turned into a bigger kind of booklet. And then it turned into a book, which was called Backs, Brains and Breathing, which we've now reprinted 16 times. And I just drew the pictures. I mean, now with desktop publishing, that's just a doddle. In those days, it had to be scanned and written and typed, and, there was no, when I was young, it was really hard. Now I would say, then a couple of my patients were publishers. One was with the ABC. They saw the book. They asked me, could I do a book? And it went from there. So I would say, if you really think that you've got something good and something unique, self-publish it, and have a crack, and it back yourself. And but I would there's a lot of really good freelance editors. I would get a good freelance editor and pay them the money to edit it, because one of the things that I learned when I did my book with the ABC is, when you get a professional editor, when you're too close to your own content, you think it's great, and you think everything's really important. And I'd send things to Jen, like, say 2 pages, and she'd send it back and she'd say to me, Anna-Louise, I know you think that's really important, but this is all I want of that. And it would be 1 paragraph. And I'd be like, what about all that, And she'd just say, it's not important. And I think that's probably one of my biggest take homes is, don't talk to people who know you and love you. Talk to people who are external. If you're going to go into any kind of messaging, any kind of media, you're too close to it. You need people to say that's not important.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good.
Not you, Doug.
Well, I guess I call it the red biro syndrome. Having done a PhD, I certainly had to develop a thick skin to that sort of process, because you write all this stuff and it comes back and you've got 2 words left behind. It's like, can you develop these 2 words? You go, what?
I know. That was also good. Yeah.
What about the rest of it?
That's it.
Now, one of your books, Fix Your Back, in the information blurb, I thought this was interesting, describes you as a celebrity physiotherapist.
Yeah.
So how did you become a celebrity physiotherapist, and what does it actually mean?
Oh, dear. Well, I think it was pretty easy, because there's not many physios on the telly. So I think that's really how that came about. I was treating where we were at Willoughby at Physiocise is very close to Channel 9. And so we started to get quite a lot of people coming through from Channel 9. Well, first of all, I did my book with the ABC, and that when you do that, in those days, they used to, so that was back in 2000 and maybe 2001, something like that. They used to do a big media roadshow, and they would put on a dedicated media person, and you would do 60, 80 interviews, over a period of about 2 weeks. It was amazing. And because a lot of medical people aren't very good at being sort of light and bright about their subject matter and succinct, and I'd like to think fairly amusing, it was quite an unusual approach. And generally I'd get off the phone from a radio interview, or I'd get off air, having done Today's Show or something like that, and they'd just say, "Can you come back?" And they'd say, "Have you got anything else you want to talk about?" And I'd go, "Oh, yeah, well, yeah, we could talk about this." And so suddenly, you're on a lot of stuff, and the more stuff you're on, and the more you deliver it, and the more you say you're going to deliver it, and you deliver it, and you deliver it on time, people just ask you back. And then it got to the point that I was doing, regular Today Show, regular ABC, regular radio. Then I was asked to do, there was a series with the ABC called Making Australia Happy, and I was asked to be the expert on that. And then that was really successful. They did Making Couples Happy. And so it sort of grew from there. And then the ABC asked me to do a whole series of videos and DVDs, and then that morphed into a whole massive big other project.
Now, one of these was the health app, Happy Body at Work, which was a joint venture with the ABC, the commercial side of it. What was your role in that startup, and did that just sort of flow on from these other things?
Yeah, well, the ABC commissioned me to do 30 videos, 35-minute videos. It was the beginning of sort of short form video. This is about 2010. So up until then, most things were more long form, like 30 minutes, something like that. But it was the beginning of sort of snackable information. TikTok didn't exist. YouTube was kind of just starting really to find its feet. And so we made these 5 topics: women in their 50s and 60s, 60s and 70s, 40s and 50s, kids. And then we did these 5 for travel and 6 episodes for travel and 6 episodes for the office. So it's 30 episodes altogether. Now, at this time, there were still ABC shops. So they were selling, DVDs, but very quickly those shops were closing down. DVD recorders were, a thing of the past.
What's that?
They were exactly, that's right. And so I said to them, "Look, we've got all this fantastic content. Corporates are desperate for content. A lot of corporates now then were looking for, first of all, Qantas was looking for content because somebody had a DVT and died on a flight. And so they asked me to do a whole series called the Qantas Comfort Zone. And so I did that for 10 years. I wrote every takeoff and landing on Qantas. There was me on the audio when there was audio saying, "Don't forget to do your exercises, blah, blah, blah." And I wrote nearly 40 2-minute pieces for Qantas. And then Qantas said, "What about some videos?" So we made these videos, and they were shown on all Qantas planes. And from there, I said, "Well, look, people are buying content. Why don't we package it up and turn it into a program?" And so corporates could actually buy it, put it on their intranet, and it would be high quality, evidence-based, but entertaining. And we had the ABC brand behind it. And instead of having piles of DVDs sitting in our garages. And so they said, "That's fantastic. Let's do it." And so it was the first time, only after the Wiggles, that they'd gone into a commercial joint venture with an external party. And so for 5 years, we had this amazing ride where Happy Body was great. I mean, it's amazing when if you ring Optus, head of HR, and say, it's Anna-Louise Bouvier Physio from Willoughby, they go, yeah, okay. Whereas you go, hi, it's Anna-Louise Bouvier, I'm calling from the ABC. It's like, oh, well, put it through, And so that was just extraordinary, just having that it's the ABC, people absolutely, it gave us incredible credibility. And so from there, we rolled out what I would call the analog version of the program, which was basically, we did an initial assessment online, a survey monkey. We got lots of great data from it. I mean, we used the same principles we use for Physiocise and for everything, really. And then we set up this program where we sent out programmed weekly videos. And then there were also posters that arrived. It was a whole event in a box. So it was a launch event, an initial assessment, 6 weeks of content, a post survey, just like exactly the same as if you rolled out any kind of a clinical trial, really. And then we could see how many people were watching the videos, and we could see the attendance at the events, and it was great. And from that, sort of like Dr. Dalton was my first great protagonist. Optus was our first really big name corporate, and they were really go ahead. And they said to us, this is fantastic, but we'd like an app because we'd like to roll out something digitally across all 1,500 stores across Australia. And could you build something? And we went, oh, how hard can that be? And so we asked them for a huge amount of money, and they said yes and gave it to us. And we happened to have this amazing digital team internally in the ABC who were quite extraordinary. And it was just the learning lesson of a lifetime. And we managed to crack it. And at the same time, we got them to give us some money so that Macquarie Uni would do a analysis, and we did it all. So we had a full university analysis of the app, and the great thing with app is you're collecting lots of de-identified data, so you've got really real-time statistics. It could have been a complete disaster. Looking back now, it could have been the biggest disaster ever, but luckily it wasn't, and it just went from there.
Yeah, that's great. So another little gem in your crown I've noticed is that you're also a listed keynote speaker in the industry, sort of that hires people to inform and educate and also entertain.
Yeah.
How did you get into that?
So that really, a lot of that, I did a lot of public speaking when I was at school. So I did a lot of debating, and I did rostrum voice of youth, which was, something, that I think is probably still around at various things. There's probably Toastmasters and stuff like that now. I'd always really liked speaking. I like educating. I like walking into a room and seeing people kind of disconnected and thinking, oh, here comes the health and wellbeing speaker. And then suddenly going, this is me. She's talking about me, and that really rings my bells. I love it. And as a result of Happy Body at Work, we did a launch, which is essentially like a keynote. And so I was doing an enormous amount of speaking. And from that, I think the thing, if anybody's thinking of getting into keynote speaking, it's practice, practice, practice. I honestly have spoken at so many events where it's just like Spinal Tap, that movie where there's like no one in the room, or, 3 men and a dog in the middle of some country town in the middle of nowhere. And, you've got to put as much energy into that as you do into, 1,000 people at the entertainment centre. Honestly, I would speak at anything to get practice. And I would say, even just in starting your practice, just saying to local businesses, would you like me to come and talk to your staff? Would you like me to, if you've got a mine near you, would you like me to come and do a free? Honestly, so much of it was for free. And that's probably actually another really big life lesson is you've got to do so much for free to get opportunity. 90% of my media work, unpaid. You really don't get paid for a lot of stuff, but it's all leverage for where you're going next. So, and probably, a lot of the local doctors never charge them. It's just all about that quid pro quo, not in a mercenary way, but I think, I think there's a lot of stuff that you do, as a way to develop relationships.
Yeah, I mean, you go back to the sports physio analysis too. There's a lot of physios that spend a lot of time on cold seats for free to be available for that paying gig that when it does come up as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Anna-Louise, what would you say is the hardest lesson you've learned as a physio?
I think the thing that disappoints me constantly is that it is so hard to change behavior. It's very, very easy to get the 20% who are already interested. But trying to scoop up the 80% or even the 90% that aren't, that has been my driving force. I think my whole career is, how can I get people interested when they haven't got a problem? And that is the thing behind prevention. Like when you've got a problem, when you've got pain, you'll do anything. But how do we move in this public health arena? And I find it incredibly disappointing that a lot of the research that happens in this area, they're not understanding that in order to really create momentum in this area, you have to look at advertising, you have to look at media. You can't speak in the way that research happens, because it doesn't work. It's too dry, it's too boring, and we have to let go of some of our, highbrow. I mean, I'm sure people say, oh, she's so light, about the way that I develop stuff. There's good depth underneath that, but you can't get people interested with randomized controls, and that's probably one of the biggest sad things I guess I have, is that not just physio, health generally just doesn't get how we can harness the power of gaming, of, all those things, those areas. They know how to addict people to social media, to think we need to use those things for good instead of for evil.
Yeah. So what you're saying, even though you might seem light and easy, it's a conscious decision, because that's the way it's going to get consumed.
Absolutely.
And I think the other thing you're bringing to that point is knowledge translation. So for me, it's the same thing with PhD, looking at how to encourage people to consider the positions that they sleep in at night, because that's going to impact upon their capacity to recover. And, there's this sort of knowledge translation gap of something like 20 years between we know something, but then actually getting it out into the public arena to be utilised. It's just too big a time frame. It's too big.
It's too big. And I think we have to have some confidence in our clinical reasoning. And you still have to be across all the research. And every time on radio, I'm on the ABC, fortnightly, and I think probably my greatest pleasure is that, we've never had a complaint. So to me, that's like, I always think some university's going to ring up and say, she can't say that, but in my head, every time something comes out of my mouth, I think, could I back that up? Could I say that? Would that be okay for me to say that? So just thinking about ways to say things so that you tread that line of expertise, but also to entertain and educate, because things that people go, oh, that's interesting, are going to stick. And I think that's very, very important.
Yeah, well, you got to also speak the language of the person that is listening. So, you talked about Italian and English, but I talk about just community language, like things that they understand. And again, my analysis is I've got a bunch of farmers and dock
Yes.
workers and tradies, and
Yeah.
if I don't speak to them in the language that they understand and give them analogies that relate to what they do, it's not going to stick.
It's irrelevant. And also to give them outcomes that matter to them. I think, that's another really important one, range of movement. Oh God, sorry, this is my father. I'm going to have to call him in a minute. They're here for the country. So I think the when you think about range of motion, pain, all those typical things that we've used to show progress, patient-specific functional scales, and fear avoidance questionnaires, all those sorts of things are so much more relevant. What matters to you? Lifting a hay bale is that's really the thing that matters to you. So yeah, okay, I can touch my toes, but I can't lift that hay bale, or I can't sleep through the night, or I need to be able to get up and stack things on pallets or whatever it is. I think that's when you're talking to a really broad, say with a corporate audience, we had to come up with very different things instead of talking about pain, because even though we think everyone's got pain, a lot of people don't have pain. But what a lot of people do have is fatigue. So once we started talking about, would you like more energy? Would you like better sleep? Would you like to feel more buoyant? Then people went, I'd like to feel like that. And so suddenly, you've got them.
Yeah, yeah. Good. Just to remind yourself to sort of tailor the message to people that are either paying the bill or listening to or employing it. So they're good messages. Hey, for $200 or less, what's your best app, tool, or investment that you've made in regards to assisting your clinical development?
Look, I was thinking. There's 3 books. There's a book. I know I talk about old school, but there's nothing wrong with books.
A book? Show us a book.
I know. I can give you lots of apps, but in terms of a book, there's a book and a podcast and a series called The Power of Habit. And it is an awesome book looking at how to create behavior change. He's a New York Times bestseller. In fact, I was looking for it before and I've lent it to someone, and but you can get it online. You can get it on your Kindle. But it is a really fantastic look at how you create habits, and how you create habits through advertising, through bad habits and good habits, how you create addictions. That was a really big driver for me, understanding some of the triggers in terms of the neuropsychology of habits. There's been a lot of books like that since, but that one's better than most. The other one is this incredible book called Simplicity by Edward de Bono. It's a very old book, but it is the most incredible book. It's written in 2 levels. At one level, on one side of the page, it has big letters of what the summary of that side of the page is, right?
Cool. Yeah.
And the whole book, and if you open the first few pages, it says you can either read this book or you can go to page 196, and it's the summary of how to read this book. And I think that is a very fascinating, it's got an incredible, it was probably one of the first ways where someone's really thought about that simplicity is not being simplistic. And I think that to me has been an incredible driver in everything that I create in terms of content. Is this simple? Is it delightful? And is it snackable? So simplicity, delight, and snackability are really should be big drivers in everything you do. There's also an incredible series. This he's done amazing podcasts as well, Malcolm Gladwell. This is called The Tipping Point. And it's all about how things tip. And one of the things he talks about in this is how Pilates tipped, and why did that tip from being just an exercise thing to being sort of happening all over the world. but he's written a whole lot of different books, a lot of podcasts. He's very vox pops, and you will see an equal number of podcasts saying, "Oh God, you can't believe everything Malcolm Gladwell says," because the science behind it isn't exactly right. But he has sold tens of millions of books, and I think you will see that. I think I'm a lifelong learner in terms of just staying up to date with your research. Keep going on all that. Go to the APA. Go to every course you can. Do everything you can there, but broaden your horizons by starting to look at outside the scope of your practice with things like great communication tools and stuff like that, so that when you have your idea, your next big idea, that you can take it to the world.
That reminds me, I just recently read James Patterson's book called James Patterson.
Yeah.
And I've read a lot of, that sort of genre, I guess, and I came across this book and my wife got it for me. She said, "Oh, you've read this book, so why don't you read about him?" And I was staggered by his background, like where he came from and his editorial and advertising and writing and how he rose up through those ranks. And then he just said, "No, I want to start writing." And he basically, I guess you could say, commercialized the writing of books, and it's made him the #1 books writer seller in the world.
Yeah.
But to read about how, because he goes for that simplistic as well, because he comes from advertising, he says, you've got like 3 seconds or 5 seconds. And he said, so if you look at my paragraphs and my sentences and my chapters, they're all snackable, they're all delightful, and they're all short.
That's it.
And he's completely rewritten the way to write a story.
Exactly. And that's, to me, it probably takes you 3 or 4 years out, maybe a bit more, before you start to realize that, there's a lot of people who know the same stuff as you. But the difference is when you start layering all this icing around it, and I would say, when a lot of young physios, they get to that 3 to 5 year mark where they go, I don't want to do this anymore. It's just not ringing my bells. You can still use your skills in so many other ways. That's certainly what I've done. I'm still a physiotherapist, but I've pivoted back and forth in my career. In fact, the other day I'm back teaching classes at Physiocise at 7 o'clock in the morning because we had a couple of staff sick, and I thought sometimes it's great to go back on the tools and go all the way back and go, I love this. I love seeing patients. I don't want to do it all the time, but nothing is ever wasted. And even if you decide to go into corporate, or if you decide to go in-house, or if you decide to become a sports physio, or if you decide to build apps, which is kind of what I do now, or consult, it's the same sort of stuff. You're always educating, looking at behavior, and giving people great outcomes. And you can use that in so many different ways.
Yeah. Hey, Anna-Louise, what would you say is your most out on the limb decision you've made in regards to your career, and what was the outcome of it?
I think starting Physiocise. I mean, I had no job when I started Physiocise, and I had 2 little kids, and I had no husband either at that stage. For it was a really difficult time in my life. I was only 31. And I had a 2.5-year-old and an 11-month-old, and I'd stopped working with Joey because it was really too hard to work earlies and lates with young kids, and then I found myself a single mum, and I just thought I have to work out a way to try and work and have school holidays off, and I need to earn more money per hour than just, working as a normal physio. And I think this idea has legs. And I can remember like those first, the first year, with my little cat, I had a Lego box that the kids used to put their Lego in. That's where I put my money. And I'll never forget the day that I was counting up and I'd made $1,000 in the week in cash, you know, and I was like, being Italian, you know, if it's in cash, it's even better. And I was looking at it just going, oh, wow, I've made $1,000, you know, and now that's not much at all, but that was such a big decision. And my mother used to ring me every other week and say, go and work for someone else, you know, a bit like I say to my kids now, go and work for someone else. It's so hard. You know, why do you want to do this Physiocise thing? You know, just it's too hard to do this. But I just felt there was a real need. And it was just, you know, there was, you know, it's just that I was so far ahead of the game that it just took so long to convince people that it was a thing. And I would say there's probably people listening to your podcast, hopefully with their big idea where they go, I just know, like often when I'm teaching at Macquarie, there'll be someone who is a fantastic climber, say, and he's been climbing since he was 12 years old. And he knows that there are no physios who specialize in training rock climbers for free climbing, say, you know, and he just knows that if he goes deep in that area, there's enough people that he could make this amazing career out of it, you know, and that excites me to hear people going, you know it's there, you know your audience, you know there's a need, you know, just back yourself and go for it.
Yeah. Hey, that Lego box must have felt like your little treasure chest. Have you still got it?
Do you know, I do. I kept it. I put it was like this big brick, you know, that they used to put. They probably still make them.
Yeah.
It was so cute. I mean, you know, back in the 90s, there was no online banking or any of the stuff like that. So, yeah, it was all cash in a Lego box.
So what 3 things stand out in your professional life so far for you?
I think, do you mean 3 things that I've done or 3 things that I think matter?
I would go the latter. Like, we do things, but I think what matters is more important.
Yeah. I think we have to change behavior. We have to crack that nugget. You know, to me, it's like now with this incredible aging population who are so deconditioned, and there's so little resources to keep them moving, and because they're going to live till they're 100, you know, we need to crack the 2 ends of the spectrum. We need to crack, how do we get older people moving en masse and motivated to move in a scalable way? You know, how is that going to happen? How can we keep people moving, sleeping, active, connected? You know, that to me is a huge nugget to crack. And then how can we get at the other end of the scale this disaster that is the sedentary behavior of young people who are going to be more like this age group in their 50s because they have never moved and they've spent so much time in front of screens. I think, you know, to me, they're the 2 standouts in terms of what really matters to me is how can we shift the dial on both of those? And then how can we do it in a way that is entertaining? You know, I think to me, that is a critical nugget for me is, you know, people need to enjoy what we do. You know, everything else is too hard. So let's try and work out how to make doing hard stuff enjoyable. And if I crack that before I die, I'll be very happy.
There'll be an OBE coming your way for sure.
Oh God, I don't know about that, but it's physio is an awesome career. You know, it's just a fantastic career. I couldn't recommend it more highly.
If you could step back to your younger self, and I'm not saying that that's such a big step, but what 3 bits of advice would you like to share with yourself, knowing what you know now?
It's going to be really hard. It's going to be quite frustrating, because you're going to have to push hard against existing paradigms, but it's really worth it. So even though it's hard, even though you've got to keep pushing, it's really been absolutely worth it. And I think a lot of young physios, it's really hard and you've got to push, and they just go, I'm going to do something else. And I think also I would say that it's never going, as a normal physio, you're never going to make gazillions of dollars, which is hard if you live in a capital city, but your rewards are enormous. Like, as my husband, who's in finance, says, you never hear a bunch of accountants 30 years in sitting around talking about what happened with their patients and what's their doing. And you do hear that from myself and my colleagues. We still love it all these years later. So there's a lot of rewards and a lot of passion you'll get from your career, but they may be intangible, those rewards.
Yeah, it sounds almost like a discussion I have every day with persistent pain patients. It's going to be hard work, it's going to be frustrating, but the rewards are going to be worth it down the track.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to see, like with pain patients, to see how you can change their brains and change the way they look at pain, and how amazing has all that research been in the last 20 years, to see what Lorimer and David and all those people have done. And when they first started talking about it, same thing. David was so entertaining, Lorimer was so entertaining, and that was like, oh, is this serious? Well, it's so serious, but it's, they looked at things in a very different way, and now it's mainstream.
Yeah. And looking forward, where do you want to see our physio profession going in the next few years?
I'd like us, the trouble with physio is it's too broad. So it's so hard for one association to advocate on behalf of an entire profession, because it's so hard to say, what do we do? But I would like our profile to be higher in terms of the value that we can bring to very specific target markets. So I think we've got to push hard to be the solution to a lot of the chronic health problems that are coming. And if we don't push hard, we're going to be sort of pushed into a very narrow area. So I would like us to push much harder to be recognised, and that is very hard because the APA has limited funds to advocate on behalf of everyone, and limited time in front of government and stuff like that. But I feel like we're losing ground, and I would like us to not lose ground in the prevention space. I think in the acute management space, we're fine. But in the prevention and public health space, I think we have such a role to play. And I that's where I feel like we've lost a lot of ground.
Yeah. So I'm thinking there about the standard class, say I'm doing a class and I see a patient and maybe their lunge is a bit valgus, or maybe they're not standing with enough erection through their upper spine. I'll go over there and say, look, here's your head, or here's your knee, or look at this position. So you apply that hands-on biomechanics and you sort of guide them almost like Alexander or a Feldenkrais type approach. But that's what I don't see when you go to a general exercise class. This is like everybody doing the same thing and that's it, And I agree. I think that in the world of prevention, we can apply or utilize our biomechanics and our understanding of pathology and make that class, make that individual an individual within a class rather than just a class of classes.
That's it. And if you think back to right where we started talking about the cars, if you think about, it's like that great Formula One, series that we've got, we've got all these people starting on the track, and, if they've got dodgy wheel alignment, if there's something wrong with their axle, if the body of the car's not right, if they're not aerodynamically, then, things are going to fall apart when they put the pedal to the metal. So, it's sort of, we are really expert in being able to kind of change things. And then to take that and make it even bigger, I think that is really a huge, because everyone's got something. And when you look at an aging population, all those comorbidities, they might have COPD, they've got OA, they might have some cognitive issues, they might have had a mild stroke, they might have all those things. But physio has the ability to look at them across all those comorbidities and go, here's something that you can do. And I think that's just awesome that, that we can deal with them on so many different levels.
Yeah, no, I agree. And Louise, where do you see yourself going over the next few years? What are your sort of goals and pursuits?
I am currently looking at a couple of very, very big tech projects around scaling exactly what we're talking about for an aging population. And that's very interesting, working with people who build really great apps and digital solutions which could potentially be used in retirement, independent living, and then all the way up to nursing homes. So to see whether, is there a way to make something so interactive and intrinsically motivating that you could get people moving. That would be a nirvana. So that's a kind of, there's a big love project there. I've become the national patron of Coast Trek, which is a fantastic, there's one in the Margaret River, and there's one in Sydney, Mornington Peninsula, down on the Freycinet coast in Adelaide, and one on the Sunshine Coast, where they've raised $50 million so far for Fred Hollows and then mental health, but over the next 10 years, it'll be for the Heart Foundation. And so using that money for research into better outcomes for women's health, particularly in the heart space, is going to be pretty amazing. So that's my love project, is Coast Trek, and my brain project will be the other project. But I'm still doing a lot of media, which I love. I love having a chat, as you can see, and getting on the radio and having a chat. And if there's one thing people say to me so often, they go, "Oh, I never knew physio could be that interesting." I go, "Oh, great."
And that in itself is a shame, because it is so interesting.
So interesting.
It's so broad. There's so many niches involved. Like,
Absolutely.
it's just,
there's so much, but the general public think, just don't, they just see it as very bland. And I think if my role is to make people realize that, physio is great, and for you and for everyone, and everyone who listens to, Richard Glover and I talking says, wow, I didn't know that if I stood on one leg for 10 seconds, if I can't stand on one leg for 10 seconds, my risk of dying in the next 10 years increases by 50%, then, that is all I need to do is stand on one leg and practice it, and I can improve my balance between 100 and 200% the next 2 weeks, so, you kind of go, this is stuff that really matters to your life, and you can act on it today.
Thank goodness we all brush our teeth because it gives us a chance to practice our
That's
one-legged balance.
That's it.
Hey, Anna-Louise, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure. I sort of say that a lot, but I do mean that because your communication style, and I'm sure there's somebody out there listening that's going to have a big idea, and this is sort of perhaps giving them the motivation or the courage to step forward and to plan the next few steps in their action process to make it a realization rather than just sitting it in the back burner. So, thank you so much. It's been really good.
It's been my pleasure too. I've really enjoyed it, Doug. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about stuff that I don't talk about very much.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Physio+10, in which I trust you gained some valuable insights. It'd be awesome if you could leave your 2 cents worth as a review or rating of this podcast, and I look forward to sharing the story of another trailblazing physiotherapist with you in 2 weeks' time. Stay safe. Bye for now.